Thank you, Emily. Welcome, everyone, on behalf of the Katz Center. I need to begin, as always, by thanking our amazing partners. The museum and the Feinstein Center and the Katz Center together make a kind of incredible trifecta of resources and staff and creativity, and it's just been an incredible privilege to be a part of that team, so thank you. In particular, I want to call out Ivy Barsky and Emily August here at the museum, who have worked with us on many programs in the past and who have many reasons to be naysayers when I bring them ideas, sometimes interesting, sometimes crazy. They generally are not naysayers, and that's an amazing and valuable thing to have. I also want to recognize Lila Corwin-Berman, the director of Temple's Feinstein Center, who was really my partner in crime in conceiving, creating, curating this particular program. Lila and I shared this as a kind of passion project, and she really wanted to be here today and share the stage as well. Due to some personal circumstances, she wasn't able to make it, so she's here in spirit at least. So, on to today's program. It's to me to start things off, and as I think we must, anytime we are commencing an intense intellectual investigation of something serious, we are going to begin with a tired cliche. And that cliche is the one about there being 3 opinions for every 2 Jews. So we all know this cliche, right? We're not going to talk about the opinions in particular today, or we're not going to focus on the opinions. Instead, the idea of this program is to think about the experiences of division that cliche gets at. So division within the Jewish community, right? The 2 Jews have different opinions, but also even within one person. If there are 3 opinions, then each one has to have 1.5 opinions. And what does that look like, right? So you will for sure hear opinions this afternoon. You will probably disagree with some of those opinions. I will disagree with some of those opinions. I will probably disagree with you on some of your opinions. The speakers will disagree with each other. So what we're asking everyone to do, the idea of this exercise, is to set aside the expectation or the necessity of coming to some agreement, and instead look together at the one really obvious common ground that we share, which is this condition of disagreeing. So, as a perpetual minority throughout millennia of dispersion, throughout different religious and cultural contexts throughout the globe, Jews know a little something about dissent and political difference, about what it means to set yourself apart or be set apart. They've not only differed from the majority religion, as we know in most cases, but also often been at odds with moral and political elements of the cultures in which they've built their lives, and indeed in which they've chosen to build their lives. Within the Jewish world, too, fragmentation and fracture have been just as frequent as any sense of unity that we might imagine through rose-colored glasses to have been the result of, facing shared tribulation and forging a community against all odds. Lately, people have been speaking as though the divisions that we have today within Jewry are unprecedentedly deep or harsh, that unlike ever before, they are paralyzing and perhaps even fatal. And what Lila and I wanted to do with this program is to bring a little perspective to that and suggest that the condition of division isn't necessarily fatal, or maybe it is, but even if it is, or especially if it is, that means we ought to think about it a little bit and focus some attention on that particular characteristic of Jewish life. So the idea is to humanize this sense we have and connect with our differences as experiences rather than as positions on a political spectrum. So I also want to just say that besides me and Emily, who you just heard, no one who will come on stage today is doing so as a representative of an organization. No one was asked to speak in support of or against any particular political view. We didn't even ask people to talk about particular political views, right? So instead, everyone's just going to tell stories. It's a kind of a story slam, This American Life episode about division in Jewish culture to get at the full complexity of what this fracture looks like, what dissent means to a single person or to a community, what it costs, what it can lead to. So by the by, we will hear stories about fractures centered on Zionist, Arab, Mizrahi, American, Israeli, conservative, Orthodox, secular, anarchist, and many more different kinds of positions. But we certainly haven't tried to be representative, to map all of the fault lines within Jewish culture. That would be clearly a losing proposition. We would never make anyone happy. So we haven't tried. Instead, the focus was on presenting a range of different kinds of stories. So lifelong journeys, ephemeral moments, angry tirades even, perhaps, art. The stories will voice concerns about artistic, literary, philosophical, and family issues just as much as political ones, because that's how human beings work. So as you listen, we invite you to think about your own stories of fracture, your own experiences of dissent and difference and disagreement. And think about if and how these cracked voices can be woven together somehow, yours and theirs and mine. If they can, what broader narrative might emerge? Or can't it? If not unity, then what? Then what are we talking about? So after the 6 stories, our idea was not to go directly into a Q&A as a group where you will directly ask our speakers, but rather to adjourn to the lobby where we'll have a reception and we can all bond over the real common denominator of food for a meet and greet, tell our stories, and make our separate voices heard. I will also say that I will introduce each speaker. We're not going in the order in the program to keep you on your toes just a little bit. And the order is known only to me, made up according to a top secret algorithm. So just listen, and I will give you a brief introduction of each person. They'll come up, and if you want to know more about the person, you can either meet up with them after and ask them about their story, or you can read about them in the program. So our first storyteller is Sam Brody, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Kansas and a fellow this year at the Katz Center. I've had the pleasure all year of knowing him there. His doctorate is in the history of Judaism from the University of Chicago. He has a master's from JTS and his BA from the UVA. His research is really wide-ranging, but focuses especially on how Judaism is interpreted in relationship to contemporary political and economic contexts. And he is the author of a book coming out later this year called This Pathless Hour, The Theopolitics of Martin Buber. Sam.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Anne, for the introduction. Thank you to the Katz Center and the Feinstein Center and to the museum. I actually wasn't trying to intersect with the 1917 theme when I came up with this idea that I would talk about Emma Goldman. It just was pure serendipity. And I hope it will set the stage for the other speakers, many of whom will be telling you more personal stories that have to do with themselves and their own lives. On December 21st, 1919, almost a century ago, Emma Goldman was deported. The New York Times was there to watch her ship leave port, and it gloated that Americans know the revolutionary aliens now. They are determined that these soldiers of disorder shall be driven out. As far as the old gray lady was concerned, what happened that day was that 249 persons who didn't like America left it. As it happens, most of the deportees weren't anarchists, although they were Russians and union members. But it was Red Emma who snagged the headlines and colored the coverage. After 30 years of battle, America and J. Edgar Hoover had won, and criminal anarchy had lost. Readers of the Times might have wondered what took so long. The name of Emma Goldman had been a curse in American politics Since 1892, when her comrade and lover, Alexander Berkman, had tried and failed to assassinate the industrialist Henry Clay Frick in the wake of the Homestead Massacre. Berkman got 22 years in prison, but the police were unable to prove any connection between Goldman and the crime. And so a dance of sorts began. The police would pressure Goldman's landlord to evict her. She would move into a brothel. Government agents would attend her lectures, just hoping to see if they could arrest her for something. She started carrying a book whenever she spoke, just in case she wound up in jail. Once she was speaking to an audience of impoverished and unemployed workers, and she suggested to them that if they could not get work and they could not get bread, they should steal bread. So she was arrested and put in jail for incitement to riot. Another time, she was arrested and put in jail for distributing illegal information about birth control. She used her time in jail to improve her English and at one point learned midwifery. When Leon Czolgosz, an American-born factory worker and registered Republican, assassinated President McKinley in 1901, he claimed that Emma Goldman had inspired him, or so the police said. They arrested her again, but once again they failed to prove any connection between Goldman and this crime. So it wasn't until World War I, the Espionage and Sedition Acts, and the Red Scare that they finally got her. Goldman was a symbol for everything evil in American politics at the turn of the last century. The foreigner, the radical, the terrorist, the woman who didn't know her place. And she was a Jew. Of course, the Yiddish anarchists rejected Judaism with a force and a fury, similar to the way that the Italian anarchists rejected Catholicism. The culture of the Lower East Side, of the Freie Arbeiterstimme and the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, was that their only connection to Judaism was the annual ball that they held, of course, on Yom Kippur. But that only made them scarier to the Knights of American Nativism, who weren't inclined to discriminate between Jews and Catholics any more than they were to discriminate one kind of red from another. As far as they were concerned, hordes of swarthy, shifty Southern and Eastern Europeans had swarmed the country, bringing their radical politics with them, and when the war came, it was time to kick them out and fortify the borders. No more nice Mr. Uncle Sam. What the patriots and populace failed to see was that much of the radicalism that was fueling the Red Scare was homegrown. For every Alexander Berkman, there was a Big Bill Haywood. For every Emma Goldman, there was a Voltairine de Cleyre. Goldman herself was only 16 when she came to the United States. Sure, she was interested in Russian politics. It would be hard not to be when the Tsar had just been assassinated and Jews were subject to more or less constant pogroms. But her political awakening came right here in the United States, in the aftermath of the Haymarket affair in Chicago. A bomb went off as police were violently breaking up a rally for the 8-hour day. The public and the police, of course, blamed the anarchists. The anarchists blamed the Pinkertons, but nobody really listened to them. 8 men were arrested and charged with conspiracy. 2 of them had been seen visibly up at the front of the stage making speeches when the bomb went off, not throwing a bomb. One of them had been at home playing cards. Another one of them, Albert Parsons, turned himself in out of sheer solidarity, believing, perhaps naively, that no trial could go forward on such scanty evidence. But they were tried as a group and convicted as a group, and 4 of them were executed. 3 of the Haymarket martyrs were German-born, although they too came to socialism and anarchism in the course of their lives as workers in America. The 4th, Parsons, had been a veteran of the Confederate Army, whose family had been in North America since before the United States. But all of them, to Goldman, seemed like impossible noble heroes, dying in the service of a glorious cause, which they called anarchism, and which she promptly determined to learn everything about. But anyway, despite the American origins of this anarchism, they deported her to Russia. She had been born in Kovno in Lithuania, and the Bolshevik government had signed away any Russian claim to Lithuania in 1918, but anyway, they deported her to Russia. She spoke Russian, she was a Red, she went to Russia. At first, she didn't mind so much, because in 1919, the international left was still excited about the Russian Revolution. They had ended Tsarism, they had withdrawn Russia from the war, just as they had promised to do, and even diehard critics of state and government like Emma Goldman still expected great things from this revolution. But a funny thing happened on the way to St. Petersburg. When she arrived, she heard disturbing tales from her comrades who reported armed raids on anarchist headquarters by the secret police, imprisonments without trials, even executions. Goldman looked for confirmation or denial of these reports from her friends who supported the Bolsheviks, like the novelist Maxim Gorky and the American journalist John Reed, whose book 10 Days That Shook the World had kept her company in prison and inspired her during her final prison stay in the United States. These friends assured her that the Bolsheviks were just doing what they had to do to protect the revolution, and that any disturbing reports she had heard were probably exaggerated or even just the sour grapes of rival factions. No doubt because of their status as famous American exiles, Goldman and Berkman were eventually able to secure an audience with Lenin himself. He assured them that there were no anarchists being held in Soviet prisons for their political beliefs, and anyway, free speech was a bourgeois prejudice. You can't just let people criticize the ruling party in the middle of a revolution. When Goldman protested that she couldn't possibly align herself with a party that, even in principle, could persecute anarchists, Lenin told her that this, too, was bourgeois sentimentality. And he urged her and Berkman to consider finding some way to make themselves useful to the government. It was sort of like he hadn't heard anything she had said. Afterwards, Goldman and Berkman tried to find ways to help the revolution without working directly for the Bolsheviks, but this proved more difficult than expected. At every turn, whether they were constructing shelters for refugees, converting abandoned mansions into rest homes, or organizing public cafeterias, the party sent commissars to oversee them. Even Goldman's attempt to simply volunteer as a nurse, putting her midwifery to use, was thwarted. In February 1921, Peter Kropotkin, the world-famous anarchist prince, passed away. He had believed in the revolution, hoping that the Bolshevik consolidation of power would turn out to be a mere episode. Berkman helped to organize his funeral, and Goldman spoke in front of an anarchist crowd waving anti-Bolshevik banners. But this was the last anarchist demonstration in Soviet Russia. About a month later, Trotsky and the Red Army suppressed the Kronstadt revolt, calling the sailors' uprising a counter-revolutionary mutiny. Thousands died. Goldman and Berkman spent the rest of 1921 scheming to get out of Russia, which they were eventually able to do when they accepted an invitation to a conference in Berlin. But when they got there, they discovered that in the meanwhile, many of their friends abroad had converted to the communist cause, and their criticism of the Bolsheviks was, shall we say, unwelcome. Goldman was accused of making common cause with conservatives and reactionaries. The Nation and the New Republic turned down her articles. And meanwhile, U.S. intelligence was discouraging any European country from providing asylum. They were imprisoned in Latvia, ushered out of Sweden, and only managed to stay in Germany for 2 years. They were unwilling to go back to the USSR. They were unable to go back to the US. So they had become wandering Jews, people without a country. In the end, it wasn't even enough for Emma Goldman to dissent from both capitalism and communism. She finally dissented from anarchism too, or at least from the version of it that embraced violence. Friedrich Engels had once written that a revolution is the most authoritarian thing there is. And now Goldman realized that this was a central contradiction of revolutionary anarchism. There is no greater fallacy, she wrote, than the belief that aims and purposes are one thing, while methods and tactics are another. This conception is a potent menace to social regeneration. All human experience teaches that methods and means cannot be separated from the ultimate aim. The means employed become, through individual habit and social practice, part and parcel of the final purpose. They influence it, they modify it, and presently aims and means become identical. In the zeal of fanaticism, I had believed that the end justifies the means. It took years of experience and suffering to emancipate myself from this mad idea. Some outsiders are more outside than others. Some dissenters pay a higher price. Nowadays, you can't read 2 paragraphs of an opinion piece on the internet without running into a sentence in which the author tries to portray themselves as a free-thinking David fighting against a Goliath of orthodoxy. Pretty much every time someone claims that something called political correctness is preventing them from saying something, you can be pretty sure that they are about to say that exact thing. And the consequences will probably be slight. So I think it's worth remembering at least one image of what it really looks like to stand on principle, even when it means that you're left with no place to call home.
Thank you so much, Sam. We're going to change gears completely now and move to the late 20th century, right? Is the setting for the next talk, the next story. Karen Sofer Sharon is a Mizrahi organizer, educator, and youth worker from Queens, via Israel, via Iraq. She is a member leader at Jews for Racial and Economic Justice in New York, where she built the organization's first Mizrahi caucus, and works to develop the leadership of other Jews of color, Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews, in broader movements for justice. She'll have a personal tale for us. Karen.
So, of course, I procrastinated preparing for today. At the height of my procrastination, I decided that what I really needed to be doing was decluttering my entire house. Makes sense, right? I was reading this book called The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up by Marie Kondo. Has anyone else read that book? Show of hands? Yeah. So this book is all about the Japanese art of decluttering your home and, by extension, your life. It's supposed to solve all of your problems. It sounds like bullshit, but it's actually pretty amazing. So Kondo has an entire chapter devoted to dealing with your books. She says that you can't get away with just going down the row of your bookshelf with your eyes and deciding whether or not you want to keep or get rid of a book. She says that you have to actually take them off of your shelf, put them on the floor so you can see them right side up, just like you did the first time you bought them. Or in my case, stole them from the library, but that's not important. She emphasizes that you need to actually hold it to be able to feel the feeling you had when you bought it. Otherwise, you can't assess whether or not it brings you joy. If it doesn't bring you joy, it's out. So I recently decided to move back to Queens, New York, where I grew up, mostly because I want to be doing really kick-ass community defense work in this era, in the neighborhood that I actually grew up in, which just happens to be the most diverse area in the literal world. And also because Donald Trump isn't the only one who gets to claim ownership of my borough, in addition to everything else he owns, for now. So in the midst of my move back home, I was working from my mom's house one Friday afternoon and decided that instead of getting through all of my deadlines, including this one, what I really needed to do was go through every single book I own. So this range of books encompasses just about every emotion and opinion I had from about age 8 to 21. So I have my Roald Dahl section, I have basically everything that Sylvia Plath has ever written from when I had my heart broken at 16, all the way to a book that is actually titled Reign of the Phallus, which is about patriarchy in ancient Greece, from when I took feminism and myself a little too seriously in college. So you guys basically know everything there is to know about me at this point. So as I went through my shelf, I found a 1-inch binder at the very bottom, under a stack of albums and yearbooks, and without even opening, I remembered instantly what was inside. It was all of the materials from my bat mitzvah, my Torah portion, my Haftorah blessing, and my 7th grade level Dvar Torah of my self-righteous impressions of the world as a Jewish preteen, which was, of course, heavily edited by my mother. When I found this binder, I didn't feel nostalgic for a time when I was young, cute, and just trying to fill out the chest of my strapless bat mitzvah dress. I didn't even feel a mild sense of embarrassment thinking back on that pretty torturous time in my life when all of my peers were competing over whose bat mitzvah would cost the most. I found this binder and my heart completely sank. What I felt was such a deep, ugly sense of shame. Like any good Jewish girl, my speech was about how much Jewish people value life. Not just how much we value life, but how much more we value it than other people. Because just analyzing Torah wasn't a big enough challenge for me at age 12, I also decided to write an original poem from the dual perspectives of 2 mothers, one Jewish, one Muslim. By the way, poems with dual perspectives should always be an indicator someone's about to say something really racist because someone can only have one perspective. It turns out I had neither perspective. The purpose of the poem was to compare and contrast the experience of two mothers. It began from the point of view of the Jewish one as she sent her son off to school with his backpack and his boxed lunch. And it ended from the point of view of the Muslim one as she did the same thing, except her son's backpack had a bomb. It ended with an incredibly melodramatic line about the Jewish mother's sense of loss, the Muslim mother's sense of pride, as both of their sons die that morning. As you can see, this poem was incredibly age-appropriate. It's always been interesting to me how much we focus on this thing about valuing life as Jewish people, as if it really sets us apart from everybody else. We really like to do that. It seems like the purpose of it is not just to celebrate our own survival and resilience in the face of persecution. It's to imply that other people don't value life, that they value something else much more, like eternal glory in death and destruction. The worst part is that everyone fucking loved it. I'm not kidding when I say the entire sanctuary at my freezing cold Ashkenazi synagogue was in tears. I also have this theory that synagogues are freezing cold because of sexism, just like offices, because, everything is set at the temperature for men in suits, but, anyway. The rabbi gave his own self-righteous speech after my own about how I was the future of the Jewish people, blah, blah, blah. And I remember standing on the bima afterward, facing the open ark, saying the Shema and feeling completely overcome with a sense of purpose and direction in my life. I actually felt like the tween Messiah. Not because I necessarily believed anything that I had been saying up there. All of my beliefs were completely curated by only watching Holocaust movies whenever we had a substitute teacher in Jewish day school. But because I had never received that level of validation from adults before, and just had to conclude that this was in fact the truth about the world that I lived in. Needless to say, finding this item on my bookshelf did not bring me joy. I could just picture Marie Kondo nodding her head to me and saying, "That one's really gotta go." For almost 2 decades, I left that piece of writing at the bottom of my bookshelf where I didn't have to deal with it. What I really should have done was throw it in the trash, but I could hear every single teacher I had at Solomon Schechter just re-yelling in my head that I couldn't throw away anything with God's name on it. I would have to bury it. So instead, I settle on hiding it in a far-reaching corner of my closet where I don't have to touch it for another decade. So fast forward, I'm now a community organizer whose work focuses on transforming my Jewish community's understanding of Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism and moving them toward action against it. Natural job, right? No one in my life who wasn't around when I was 12 knows this story. I actually had a really, really hard time writing it because I felt so embarrassed, like I couldn't just get the words out. So how the hell did I get here? To be clear, I was not one of those Jews who was raised by labor lawyers. I did not grow up in a white Ashkenazi leftist Jewish home where people talked about how cool Emma Goldman was. I didn't even know who Emma Goldman was until I was 22, where I was actually tasked with creating my first work plan using a rubric of a work plan that Emma Goldman didn't actually have, but a community organizer made it for me, and it was called Emma Goldman's Work Plan. I grew up in a conservative Mizrahi community in Queens, New York, made up mostly of first-generation immigrants from Morocco, Yemen, Iran, and Uzbekistan, who were all euphemistically just categorized as Israeli and regularly referred to as violent, stupid, and deserving of constant suspension. Meanwhile, the minority of assimilated Ashkenazi kids made up the majority of our honors classes. And it was the Iraqi side of my family in particular that cursed the Arabs constantly, never ever seeing the incredibly sad hypocrisy in it. And it was my Iraqi mother who helped me write my Dvar Torah, who coached me through my pacing as I practice it, and who teared up when I shared my first draft of that beautiful original poem. I was an Arab Jew on the bima, talking about Arab people as if they weren't a part of me. And I did that for most of my life. Now I organize Arab Jewish people to understand and challenge the deep-rooted messages we've all internalized, that to be both Jewish and Arab at once is impossible, that Arab Muslim people are, and always have been, our enemies, that regardless of almost 3,000 years of so many of our ancestors living and thriving in Muslim-majority countries with other Arab people as friends, neighbors, and comrades, the only reason our families fled was fear of violence. If there's anything I've learned over the past few years, it's that the existence and history of Arab Jews is one of the only things that can expose the lies our people love to tell about who we are and how we got here. When news broke out after the election that Donald Trump was going to nominate Steve Bannon as his chief strategist, I was at a protest outside the Zionist Organization of America's annual gala where Bannon was invited to speak. Despite wanting to crawl into a hole, I spoke for the first time in front of 500 people that night. It seems Bannon made a renegade introvert out of me. The first thing I did after introducing myself was boldly identify as an Arab Jew, as a daughter of immigrants, as the granddaughter of an Auschwitz survivor. But this time, when a crowd of Jews cheered me on, it wasn't for my Islamophobic reading of the Torah. It was for demanding that our community show up as the righteous persons that our Jewish communal leaders refused to be. Thank you.
Okay, are we disagreeing yet? I hope so. I'm just going to jump right into the next one and see if we can keep this moving. So Daniel Mark is our next speaker. He is an assistant professor of political science at Villanova University, where he's also a faculty associate of the Ryan Center for the Study of Free Institutions and the Public Good, and battalion professor for the Navy ROTC unit, and a bunch of other things that are all really impressive that you should read about in your program. Daniel is also vice chairman of the 9-member bipartisan U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. His degrees, bachelor's, master's, and PhD, are all from the Department of Politics at Princeton University, and somewhere in there he found time to teach high school for 4 years in New York City. So, Daniel, welcome.
I discovered a few days ago from a friend that I was actually Karen's sister's high school teacher in my first year at a college. A nice coincidence. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I might lighten things up just a little bit after that, but actually hopefully say things that will at least upset at least as many people in the room. I'm also experimenting for the first time of reading a speech off of an iPad instead of a piece of paper. I'm hoping that this crowd in particular will be sympathetic if it's a little rough going with the technology, but I think I've got it. Anyway, thank you so much. We don't all 6 have to repeat all the same thank yous, but just want to associate myself with all the same thank yous that Sam and Karen offered to the organizers and everyone for having us here and doing such a lovely job, and to all of you for being here. So this might be an inappropriate question, and I apologize in advance if it offends you, and I hope you don't mind me asking, but why aren't you Catholic then? That was a question that a friend and former student of mine, himself Catholic, asked me one day in the course of a long phone conversation. What's funny about the question, though, is not that he asked it, but rather how often I get asked it. Now, if you can see my yarmulke from where you're sitting, that probably seems surprising to you. I'm an Orthodox Jew, so theologically, religiously, I'm Jewish. But politically, philosophically, aesthetically, socially, and even a bit culturally, I'm Catholic. I'm even known as a bit of an evangelist for Catholicism, never among Jews, but among college students and other pagans. Now, I'm a college professor, so I can say that. Now, as a quote-unquote Catholic Jew, I'm a minority in 2 ways, and you might even say a minority within a minority, which makes for some interesting experiences, as you'll hear in a moment. First, being politically and philosophically Catholic means that I'm a conservative Jew. Now, of course, you know already that I don't mean conservative with a capital C, which would put me in the majority among Jews in America, but conservative with a small c, which is a decided minority in the Jewish community, as you are well aware. And I'm not just a conservative, but, brace yourselves, a social conservative. In between college and grad school, I taught at a modern Orthodox high school, the one after the one where I taught Inbar, Karen's sister, and I had enough chutzpah to show up on National Pro-Life T-shirt Day wearing a National Pro-Life T-shirt Day T-shirt. Now, given that it was a very preppy school, it felt weird wearing a T-shirt at work, even over my button-down dress shirt. But let's just say the dress code wasn't the reason why the T-shirt didn't make it past lunch. Even among modern Orthodox Jews, social conservatism is not exactly in vogue. Although National Pro-Life T-shirt Day isn't that popular, which is why you've surely never heard of it, I've also gone many times to the March for Life, the annual pro-life rally on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., an experience I often describe as several 100,000 Christians and me. Inevitably, I get asked where the Jews are. Aren't Orthodox Jews pro-life? And the answer from me begins with something like, well, it's complicated. So dissenting politically from the broader Jewish community has been an interesting experience, but one that I enjoy, I suppose. Even among Orthodox Jews, I'm out of step as a conservative. But it gets worse. Among Jews who are conservative, small c conservative, I'm also out of step. I mean, you'd think I'd be able to catch a break among politically conservative, religiously Orthodox Jews. For example, maybe you've heard of the Tikva Fund in New York. Sam and I did a program with them once that does outstanding academic programming for everyone from high school students to advanced professionals. They're very intellectual and very conservative, though not religious. And even they think I'm crazy. In this case, though, it's not because we disagree on the issues, usually. It's because of a little thing called natural law. Natural law is a school of thought that I study and to which I subscribe. The godfather of natural law philosophy is Aristotle, but its development is associated most closely, you won't be surprised to learn, with the Catholic Church, and its most famous exponent is the good doctor Thomas Aquinas. And now I'm going to tell you how natural law got me dumped. Actually, it got me dumped several times, but for a slightly different reason than this one. Now, before you start feeling badly for me, let me say that I am recently very happily married to a wonderful woman, so it all worked out. Don't worry. Natural law, like many other forms of philosophy, contends that moral principles can be derived without any appeal to God, revelation, or theology. This means that ethical norms against killing or stealing, for example, or slavery or racism for that matter, are knowable to us solely through the use of our reason, our rational faculties. In that way, many norms that are often thought of as religious ethics, don't kill, don't steal again, don't lie, can be known without religion and can be explained without any reference to religion. I may be pretty stupid sometimes and certainly pretty oblivious. My current wife had a crush on me for 4 years before I asked her out, and I was the only person on the planet who didn't know. And though I'm pretty oblivious, believe me when I tell you that this kind of talk is not something I considered a good way to break the ice on a first date. And fortunately, with the one in question, I got way past the first date. This relationship was actually going well for a change. In fact, I really liked this girl, and she really liked me. I was thinking I might finally get married, which, as a single Orthodox guy in his 30s, was a big deal. You can ask my mother. In case you didn't know, there's a lot of pressure in the Orthodox community to get married, and I wanted to get married. But as things got more serious, and we started having real conversations about issues related to marriage and family, she found out about natural law. My girlfriend learned that I thought that ethics has an independent rational basis. I won't bore you with the details about how I believe that natural law is really built into Jewish law, but I will admit that there are some important topics where Jewish law and mainstream natural law diverge, just like you might see with respect to Jewish and Catholic views with respect to some ethical questions related to marriage and family. And because I found the differences between Jewish law and natural law to be sources of intellectual and ethical tension, she started to worry, somewhat fairly, where I get my values from. In the end, no matter how much I protested, I could not convince her that I was really a follower of Jewish law rather than a follower of natural law who also happened to follow Jewish law when it coincided with natural law. I could not convince her that I truly accepted the authority of the rabbis and halakha. So I got dumped. At that time, this was pretty devastating. For one thing, obviously, I was upset about the breakup with a girl I liked, only natural. Moreover, as I suggested before, as someone who had dated unsuccessfully for a while and finally found someone I thought I might marry, it was extra hard. By the way, I'd also like to mention for the record that I prepared this before I knew this was being videotaped, so it'll cut me a little slack. I should have procrastinated and done this after I knew about that. But most of all, it made me think that I might never get married. After all, where would I find an Orthodox girl who would marry a guy with my crazy Catholic views? The whole point of being Orthodox in the first place is that you stick with the tradition. So maybe I'd never get married, all because of my stupid philosophical views. That was a hard realization to take. But you can't unsee the truth. Incidentally, my wife's mom comes from a religious Catholic family. The Lord works in mysterious ways. Anyway, here I am, a minority among Jews for being politically conservative and religiously orthodox, and a minority among politically conservative and religiously orthodox Jews for being a Catholic thinker. That is, for how I arrive at my conservatism and my orthodoxy. Go figure. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. I don't know about you, but I'm already drawing a lot of connections, obvious ones. I think there's personal connections between every single person who's spoken, and more subtle ones. So there's going to be a lot to talk about afterwards. Now, Lital Levy is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at Princeton University. There's another connection, where she teaches Hebrew and Arabic literatures, Jewish studies, and literary theory. She specializes in contact zones of modern Hebrew and Arabic. And her award-winning 2014 book called Poetic Trespass, Writing Between Hebrew and Arabic in Israel-Palestine, examines the cultural politics of language in the literature of Israel-Palestine. Lital.
Thank you for inviting me, and thanks everyone for being here. So another connection, we are going back to the issue of deportation, or at least the threat of deportation, with which we began with Sam's story. So in recent months, of course, one of the many questions that has been coming up over and over is that of sanctuary and shelter. If someone you know faced the threat of deportation, would you take them in? Would you take them in even if you vehemently disagreed with everything that they believed in or stood for? So the story that I'm about to tell is from a 1977 novel by the Iraqi-born Israeli author Sami Michael. The novel is titled Refuge, in Hebrew Chasut. The time is 1973. The setting is the mixed Arab-Jewish city of Haifa during the Yom Kippur War. Communists and Zionists, Israeli Arabs, Palestinian refugees, and Ashkenazi Jews are bound together in both love and hatred. The novel covers Jewish and Arab Israelis during the first 4 days of the war. The main characters are Shula, an Ashkenazi woman, who is married to Marduk, an Iraqi Jew. Marduk, an ardent communist during his youth in Baghdad, survived 13 years of torture and deprivation in an Iraqi prison. On his release, he was essentially deported to Israel. Shula and Marduk have a little boy named Ido, who has an intellectual disability. Their closest friends are Shoshana, also an Ashkenazi woman, who's married to Fuad, an Arab Israeli, who runs an Arabic language paper for the Israeli Communist Party. They have 3 sons of mixed Jewish-Arab ethnicity who are themselves becoming torn apart by the political pressures and fractures surrounding them. Along with their other friends and family, this group forms a kind of fraternity, closely knit, and bound by ideology and loyalty to a cause. At the opening of the novel, Marduk, the Iraqi Jew, who's still a communist, has gone off in the war to fight for Israel, the country that's given him refuge. His choice to fight in the war becomes a source of constant tension throughout the events in the novel. When his wife Shula questions his willingness to fight for a country he so disapproves of, he explains that the state of Israel gave him refuge when he was hunted, tortured, and nearly executed in Iraq. Shortly after the outbreak of the war, fellow party members instruct Shula to shelter Fathi, an Arab comrade who's sought by the police for preventative, or what they call preventive detention, because as a member of the party who's known for Arab nationalist poetry, he is considered to be a security risk. After some hesitation, Shula agrees, thinking of Marduk and his own experiences in Iraq. But as she shelters the poet who is openly cheering on the advancing Egyptian army that her own husband, Marduk, is fighting, and as Jewish and Palestinian Arab visitors enter and leave the apartment discussing the war, the anguish of moral, political, and sexual tensions surface. Loyalties are questioned and tested over and over, both personal loyalties and political loyalties. As we relive Marduk's memories of Baghdad, and as we experience the suffocation Fathi the poet feels while he's hiding in Shula's apartment, and as we overhear all the different characters' debates and their inner thoughts about the big political questions, the tables keep turning around the central question of the novel, refuge. Who is giving whom refuge? What does it mean to be a host or a guest? Are Palestinians guests of Jewish Israelis or the other way around? And if the Egyptian army was to win the war, as the poet deeply believes, then who would suddenly need to be giving refuge to whom? About halfway through the novel, we're propelled into Marduk's memories of his final days as an Iraqi youth in Baghdad before his long and painful incarceration. In these days in the 1940s, these heady days, Iraqi Jewish youth are becoming politicized. They're divided between communism and the Zionist movement, both of which are illegal in Iraq and punishable by imprisonment or death. A comrade in the communist underground movement has betrayed Marduk, and he is on the run from police. When Marduk tries to return home, his own father, who's had enough, goes out to the balcony and shouts, "Police, come and get him! He's here, the communist!" Marduk relates, "It just wasn't a Jewish thing to do. Up and down the street, people threw open their windows and listened to my father shouting. They all rebuked him, but the hardest words of all came from his friend, our neighbor, Abu Ishaq. 'Shut your mouth, Abu Shlomo!' 'Police,' my father kept shouting in the freezing air. 'Come and get him! He's here!' The neighbor, Abu Ishaq, lost control of himself. 'I hope you don't see the light of dawn. Finished. Everything's finished between us.' Behind my father, my sisters stood wailing. My mother had caught my father by the shirt and was pulling him indoors. He smacked her arm and kept screaming at the scandalized neighbors. Opposite us lived the Hajjaj family, Zionists, not only sympathizers, but real activists, and hostile to me. Now their son Bahuram came out on the balcony and stood facing my father and shouted, 'You should be ashamed, Abu Shlomo.' The Zionist leaned over the railing and looked down at me. 'Marduk,' he called, 'come up here. I'll open the door for you.' That killed me. I whispered, 'Father, Father,' and I went. Later, Marduk is given refuge again by distant relatives who are also committed Zionists and who take him in unhesitatingly despite their disdain for his politics. 'Of course,' says his aunt when asked to harbor him, adding, 'I knew he'd end up like this.' But after 2 weeks, the young revolutionary decides he just can't live under house imprisonment indefinitely. He'll take his chances. Against the family's wishes, he leaves his shelter and is soon captured by the police. 13 years later, following a military coup in Iraq, Marduk is suddenly released from prison. In the meantime, his family has left Iraq along with the majority of the Jewish community, and not knowing where to go, he heads to a synagogue in the old Jewish quarter of Baghdad, where the small remnants of the community are gathered. The Jews he meets, not knowing whether or not, they don't know whether or not to believe his story. Eventually, they just give him a meal, and without his knowledge, they promptly call the police to take him back to prison. It's after this incident that Marduk is sent to Israel, where he fully expects to be arrested again, but to his surprise finds that he can resume a normal life and even protest as much as he likes without facing arrest. At the same time, he's well aware of the irony that here, Palestinian Arabs have taken his place as a Jew in Iraq. Here in Israel, it is the Palestinian communists who are routinely harassed and detained, while the Jewish communists are allowed to express themselves freely. At that moment, when she is asked to shelter Fathi, the radical poet, Shula hesitates, and her thoughts return to Marduk. Throughout the 4 days of the war that are covered in the 400 pages of this book, we never find out what has become of Marduk fighting on the front lines of the war. Shula can't reach him to consult, and so she can only ask herself what Marduk would do in her place. In the words of the novel, Shula knew very well what Fathi and Fuad, sitting in the living room waiting for her answer, had in their hearts. They were demanding and taking for granted that she would give refuge to the poet, and this at a time when they were hoping and praying for the destruction of the armies of Israel. Giving refuge to an Arab poet like Fathi would be like a bullet in Marduk's back. Yet in spite of everything, she wasn't sure what she ought to do. Marduk, who had been persecuted for so many years, had sanctified the concept of refuge for Shula. He had told her of that night in Baghdad to show that to give refuge to a fugitive was the most virtuous of acts. Shula returned to the living room and said, Fuad, you and Fathi can move the spare bed from Ido's room into the empty room. And I should add that it's in the course also of these few days of the war, and while she's giving shelter to Fathi, that Shula also realizes that she hates being part of the Communist Party. She was born into it by parents who are themselves active communists. Eventually, the poet is discovered by a Jewish neighbor in her apartment building. The poet fears that this neighbor will give him away, or at least ask for compensation for keeping quiet. In response, the neighbor, he's an elderly Jewish man, Ashkenazi man, replies that his compensation is just a little Jewish satisfaction, knowing that in history, there were, as he put it, there were very few Gentiles willing to take the risk of sheltering a Jew in a time of need. It's a pleasure, my friend, a pleasure to finally see a Jew giving shelter to a goy, even though I wouldn't say that your life's in danger. The novel leaves us asking and wondering, does the mitzvah of giving refuge transcend these deepest of differences? What do you think of Shula's decision to shelter someone who is literally wishing for the destruction of the very army that her husband is risking his life fighting in to defend her home? In closing, a few words about the novel and its author. Sami Michael, born in Baghdad in 1926, was, like his character Marduk, involved in the communist underground in Iraq. Escaping execution, he immigrated to Israel in 1949. He's a major Israeli novelist and an atheist who defines himself first as a Jew and only secondly as an Israeli. He's also president of the Association for Civil Rights in Israel. Last year, as he celebrated his 90th birthday, the novel Refuge was banned from the Israeli high school reading for their matriculation exams for political reasons. In the words of the official interviewed about this decision, this was an article in Haaretz, the official said, quote, "It didn't seem relevant to us to put into the curriculum."
All right, we've got 2 of our 6 remaining, and I think that Lital's talk will lead nicely into the next one, which is from Carol Zabar. Carol, for those of you who don't know about her, is a phenomenon. She was born in Detroit and educated at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She's the mother of 3, a photographer, a prosecutor, having gone to law school starting at age 49, I believe, and the founder now of the Other Israel Film Festival. And she's also active in a variety of liberal Jewish causes and sits on several boards in that area. Carol.
Before I start telling my own story, I remember reading Sami Michael's book, and what astounded me was that the Jewish characters in it, the Jewish communists, were rooting for the Arabs to win in the war. And they were split, but there were so many Jews that, And it was like confounding until much later on when I became much more immersed in the Palestinian Jewish community that I began to understand it. So I'll start with my story. I am a confessed red diaper baby. My parents were socialists and communists, and they didn't talk about it that openly because I was born in 1942, and in the 50s when McCarthyism was rife, all my father did was tell me the principles of communism without really laying it out. My father worked at a synagogue, and my first fracture started as a person who was taught that believing in God was exactly like believing in unicorns. So, you should put that aside. But I went to Hebrew school. I'm good at languages, and I liked it. I put aside whatever they talked about in religion because it didn't really seem to relate to me. When I graduated high school, my father wanted me to be able to put myself through school, so he sent me to an ulpan. And it was a wonderful ulpan in New Jersey. It was 2 months long, 6 days a week, 6 hours a day. And I came out speaking Hebrew. And I decided to go to the Hebrew University. I was accepted, and I loved it. I went in 1961. And if any of you are old enough to remember Israel in 1961 to 65 when I lived there, it was the best place on earth. Everybody was poor. It was socialist. The people who didn't have it so good were the Mizrahim. We hardly had any at Hebrew University. I had one girlfriend who said to me, listen, I'm going to take you home with me, but I have to tell you something. I don't want you to tell anybody. We're Kurdim. We're from Kurdistan. And, me being from Detroit, I kind of didn't get it. I said, and? She said, you can't tell anybody. So that was kind of my first introduction to how really awful it was for her. The other group that I saw at Hebrew U were the few Arabs who were at Hebrew U at the time. I think they were probably 2 or 3%. No women at all. And the men kept their heads down. They were quiet. They rarely spoke. And there was something so awful about it. I also went to school when there was the military, what did they call it? Military government over the Arabs, where they had to get permits to go out of school, to go out of their villages. So my 5 years at Hebrew University were wonderful. It was the best time. Amos Oz was in my class. Yossi Sarid was in my class. Leibovich was my teacher. I had the most wonderful time. But by the end of 5 years, I had enough of Jews. And I'm not saying that really facetiously. It was a time where Jews looked somewhat the same. You go to Israel now and Jews are everything. But at the time, there wasn't enough diversity. So I came home, married my husband, closing his eyes over there, Saul Zabar. I was his Hebrew teacher. And we actually went to live in Israel for 6 months after we got married. We went in 1969, after the Six-Day War. And I have to say, it was great. Any of you who went to Israel right after the Six-Day War, it was like, I thought it was a miracle. I who had passed that barrier every single day of my life, I swear, I never thought there were people behind it. When the wall came down and I could see Jordan, I could see the old city, it was, oh my God, this is paradise. We used to go to Jericho on the weekends where it was warm. It was just fabulous. So we lived there for 6 months. I then had 3 children. I became a photographer. We joined the Society for the Advancement of Judaism because I couldn't really figure out how to raise my kids Jewish without sending them to synagogue. I tried at one point to send them to a Jewish day school, to Ramaz, and I realized I just would not be able to do it. So my kids went to Hebrew school. They were bar and benot mitzvah. It really hasn't taken, I have to tell you. None of them has an affinity so much for religion. But all during this period, while my kids were growing up, before I went to law school, during the time, I became very interested in being active politically with things Israeli. First Peace Now, then New Israel Fund. And at one point, 10 years ago, I said, you know what? I want to do something practical. And so I founded the Other Israel Film Festival to really show people the lives of Palestinian Israelis in a way that they probably couldn't imagine them. And my partner in this is an actor, a very prominent actor called Mohammed Bakri. And he is one of mine and my husband's closest friends. I'm very involved with his family and spend a lot of time in their village. And that has given me an entirely different perspective on what it means to be a Palestinian Israeli. During the last elections, one of his sons said to me, "Oh, Carol, I'm not voting. What should I vote for? They don't want me. I can't be an Israeli." And I said, "Shut up. Do not let anybody tell you what you can be. You can only be an Israeli if you vote. Because if you don't vote, you're voting for Netanyahu." I'm sorry, I'm not really making this political. But this has really given me such a different perspective. I remember one day, one of the kids who was in college in Tel Aviv going to look for an apartment, and he said, I applied. And when they heard my last name, Bakri, they said, "Oh, sorry, our nephew has taken this apartment." I was the only person who got upset. Everybody else, they're used to it. I remember another time another son said, he applied for a job. They said, "Oh, sorry, we don't take Arabs." Again, they kind of rolled with the punches. So this has given me a completely different view. I'm looking at it more from the inside. And what I realize when we talk about fractured views, Jews here are so fractured. I will tell you about my friend Jessica. She is one of my closest friends. We ran 3 marathons together, and she is a modern Orthodox Jew. And in 1988, when I was reading Benny Morris and depressed beyond belief at what had happened, we ran marathons together. She had to listen to me. And years later, I said, "Oh, this thing in Gush Imunim that happened where they killed these Arabs was so awful." She said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Didn't you listen to me?" And she said, "No, I didn't. It made me too sad." And that was such a revelation. It was such a revelation that people who are modern Orthodox or even conservative have a view of Israel as such a paradise and that it is the land of the Jews, that they can't fathom what happened in 1947 and 1948. And I'm not meaning to revisit it, but what I'm saying is that an inability to hear. And that's what we're talking about with stories here. I actually don't know how to get past that. Because somebody who believes that Israel is supposed to be for the Jews, I don't see how that they can hear the stories of what happened to the Palestinians. So I'm going to end on that note because I don't have another note. But I think it behooves us all to really struggle to think of what stories, what engagements we can have with the other that'll give us some hope. Thank you.
That wasn't political at all. Last, and not at all least, we have a presentation from Eli Valley. And just fair warning, your program mentions this as well, his work has been called ferociously repugnant, in addition to being called hilarious. And this work has been featured in the New Republic, The Nation, The Nib, The Village Voice, The Daily Beast, The Intercept, Gawker, Current Affairs, and elsewhere. He was artist in residence at The Forward from 2011 to 2013, and he has a comics collection coming out this spring called Diaspora Boy, Comics on Crisis in America and Israel. Thank you.
Is it possible to maybe shut some of those lights so you can see the slides? Can you see it well? Yeah. All right, cool. First, for street cred, this is me protesting to release Soviet Jews. And I just wanted to include that to show my yichus, my sort of like the tradition that I have of dissent and protest in the Jewish community. And also because of the word Nazis on my sign, Nazis killed the body, Soviets killed the soul, because that's going to become more clear in a little bit. Also, my mom is here, right here, and I want to say hi, Mom. Here's a drawing I did of that actual photograph a few years ago. I'll be honest. Yeah, it's part of another comic. Anyway, I don't love it when family members come to my presentations because I spend like 80% of the time just spewing profanities, and it's embarrassing. But we're at a Jewish museum, and I can't actually, reject my mom at a Jewish museum. It's really not nice. And so I'm very happy that my mom is here. But the added bonus is if I say something like, if you give a blessing at the inauguration of a bigoted demagogue who has caused entire communities to fear for their lives, then you should be excommunicated. If we are people with a conscience and a memory. I'll just cut back to my mom and be like, yo, my mom's here, it can't be incendiary, So, anyway, I want to talk today about me and Alan Dershowitz. I apologize for that. I need a new slide, so just like quick Photoshop. And by the way, this gets actually very depressing, and so enjoy your laughs now. But before I do that, I want to talk about an email exchange I had with Alan Dershowitz, but before I do that, I want to mention the challenge of satirizing where we are now. I published a comic in January of last year, 2016, called Schlonged, after something that Donald Trump himself had said. 4 pages of Donald Trump boasting about his penis. And I did that comic because Trump, in the primaries and today, seemed to be self-parodied. So I wanted to go as far as possible while also touching on the subtext to everything Donald Trump said. Great big beautiful wall, etc. And then 7 weeks after the comic came out at a Republican debate, Trump did just that. He boasted about his penis. Satire was eclipsed once again. And so it's like an insufficient tool to compete with the current reality. And it keeps happening. I drew him with a swastika after he was found pillaging campaign materials from neo-Nazi websites. And then months later, after he became president, he opens the door of the Oval Office to white supremacists and literal Nazi allies. So it's hard to do satire when there are Nazi allies in the Oval Office. There's nothing more hyperbolic than Nazis. You can't go further than that, but you need to try. And that brings us to me and Alan. Alan wrote me this in an email in response to one of my comics, short and to the point. How I got on the list we don't have time for today, so I'm just gonna leave it at that. I can tell you afterwards if you want. I got all giddy when I got this email because it's Alan Dershowitz, and Alan Dershowitz is in many ways an icon of this generation of American Jews. Proud, pugilistic, pugnacious. 25 years ago, in this book, Chutzpah, he insisted on what he considered to be a new iteration of American Jewish identity. This is what he writes. The byword of past generations of Jewish Americans has been shanda, fear of embarrassment in front of our hosts. The byword of the next generation should be chutzpah, assertive insistence on first-class status among our peers. If we take Alan at his word, we have the power as a community to effectively fight what is happening today. Because if ever there was a time to use the chutzpah he articulated in the 90s, the time is now. So we use the tools we have. Here's a drawing I did, peaceful transfer of power to a Klansman. Maybe not the biggest stretch since Trump's father was in the Klan. Sorry, arrested at a Klan rally. He denies it, but come on. I want to emphasize we've been in a state of emergency since November 8th. Trump, a white supremacist and demagogue, is writing policy along with other white supremacists. There should be no compromise whatsoever with white supremacists. I did this comment using the horror of the Ku Klux Klan to say that this is not normal and that you cannot have a peaceful transfer of power with a movement that wants to strip entire communities of their rights. Here's another one involving Trump at the Statue of Liberty blowing out the torch with a wave of Klansmen rising behind him. But the Klan is an American story and an American phenomenon. What about Jewish history and Jewish memory? Here's another comment. Can we use the most potent and horrifying imagery from our collective experience as Jews to understand the current nightmare? This is based on the famous Warsaw Ghetto photograph. My answer, obviously, is yes, emphatically. I'd even say that in the current crisis, we are under an obligation to. Given our historical experience, we know what is happening, we feel it in our bones, and we are especially positioned to speak out. But it does get back to the inability of satire to capture this moment. When you have a president promising to publish lists of immigrant crimes, it's literally what Hitler did to demonize Jews and to help set the stage for the dehumanization of us. How do you satirize a living nightmare? A related question is this: what about using our history and memory for non-Jewish contexts? Does that trivialize our unique experience? Hush, sweetheart, and be careful with your analogies lest you cheapen the sanctity of the Shoah. In my view, no, it actually sanctifies it. Because if our collective memory is used only as blinders when similar horrors start happening to other people, then our history is worthless. All right, thanks, all right. But this gets into the question of particularism and universalism and whether we are a community that thinks only of ourselves or if our memory and experience transcends communal parochialism. By the way, this is happening. And the final, maybe most potent and problematic question, challenge is, can we use such imagery in satire or condemnation of fellow Jews? This is a comment that Alan was not happy with. It's Jared Kushner in a Nazi uniform. I was furious, and I am furious, that a Jew is giving cover to and colluding with white supremacists and Nazi allies. We should not stop being shocked by this. So in this comic, Jared Kushner is eager to build detention centers with the gay from Auschwitz. Here he is weeping because he wants to build camps for Muslims or for undocumented immigrants as Stephen Bannon spouts Holocaust denial by his side. And again, on the topic of satire and reality, a month after this comic came out, stories emerged of Bannon's Nazi sympathizer fandom. Finally, Trump agrees by making a side deal in a sleazy Russian kleptocracy operation, what's happening in current reality. And Kushner wins as Bannon asks, should I kill him now or later, folks? I was aware of the rage in this comic, the fury, and I tried to be gracious in my reply to Alan. Sorry to see you go, but I'll remove you. Diplomatic. But then Alan replied with this: Nazi symbols should be reserved for Nazis and not for the grandson of Holocaust survivors. And that's an interesting point, and if I were a purist or if we were not off a cliff right now, if Jared Kushner were not working on policies that will disenfranchise populations the way our grandparents were disenfranchised, I would be inclined to agree. The paradox is that for generations now, grandchildren of Holocaust survivors have been compared to Nazis pretty frequently. Dershowitz himself compared Richard Goldstone to Joseph Mengele after Goldstone published his UN report chronicling Israel's and Hamas's war crimes in the Gaza War of 2009. Now, I don't know if Goldstone is a child or grandchild of Holocaust survivors. I didn't, go into his family tree and his pedigree. But I do know that his Jewishness informed his approach. As he said, because of our history, I find it difficult to understand how any Jew wouldn't instinctively be against any form of discrimination. Anyway, for about a generation now, ever since Benjamin Netanyahu attended rallies comparing Yitzhak Rabin to a Nazi, which led to Rabin's murder, the criteria for Nazi comparisons within our community have been stacked. If you support human rights in Israel-Palestine or if you liken the situation in the West Bank to apartheid, it's fair game to call you a Nazi. Those have been the rules, as our new ambassador to Israel called the thousands of Jews involved in J Street. And after he was confirmed, he got a nice mazel tov from AIPAC. I experienced a Nazi comparison myself, frequently, but in a more memorable way when I drew a comic about an American Jew experiencing a crisis of faith and identity after hearing the news that Israelis had burned alive a Palestinian teenager, which actually happened. In response to the comment, the editor of Commentary hurled the slur at me, capo. Is it capo or capo? I don't even know. It's like I'm in denial about how to pronounce it. Which was weird because the comic itself was an act of outrage against the kinds of acts perpetrated by Nazis. And also he blocked me on Twitter, and these days I don't even know what's worse, being called a capo or being subjected to the Twitter block. But now that we have actual Nazi sympathizers in the Oval Office, our communal leadership, with some notable and important exceptions like the ADL and explicitly progressive organizations, has been silent at best and sometimes even complicit in what is happening. Trump needs to be given an opportunity to lead. This was the moral position staked out by the Jewish Federations after Trump appointed Stephen Bannon as chief strategist. Or I should clarify that. Because the president's Nazi sympathizers are also vocal Islamophobes and are seemingly pro-Israel, their anti-Semitism doesn't matter. We've become so accustomed to equating anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel that we are unable to see the real deal when it takes over the country. And we've become so accustomed to applauding a bigoted demagogue helming Israel's government that it's almost by reflex that we applaud America's own Netanyahu and Donald Trump. Here's an image of the standing ovation Trump received in the midst of his bigoted campaign last year after trashing Obama at last year's AIPAC conference. I want to emphasize, we Jews are not on the verge of losing our rights, but other communities are. And unless we want to forsake everything we've learned over so many millennia, we cannot stand by, and we certainly cannot join the demagogues. And if we are a community of memory and meaning, those of us who do join the demagogues, the bigots, and the racist civilizational warriors need to pay a price. Because again, we are off a cliff. And so this is my reply to Alan. I'm calling him Alan, I feel like at this point I know him. Jewish collective memory, experience, and consciousness is not limited to grandchildren of survivors. If a person uses his or her Judaism to cover up the most horrifying breaches or potential breaches of human rights in generations, then I feel it's incumbent upon us as Jews to use everything at our disposal, including our collective historical and spiritual experience, to condemn them as vociferously as possible. Just from the Jewish, this is continuing, it's a little long, I'll be done quick. Just from the Jewish perspective, dozens of JCCs have received bomb threats. Now I know we found out that it was actually some Israeli teenager, Israeli American, but substitute that with desecrated cemeteries, swastikas, the normalization of the alt-right. It was never just about the JCCs. Dozens of JCCs received bomb threats in the past several weeks because of the forces Jared Kushner helped unleash. Kushner has said nothing about this, not a word to condemn it, and yet he's celebrated as an Orthodox Jew giving a hechsher to this administration. This is a shanda. Whether or not you agree with my use of Jewish memory, I hope you'll do whatever you can to stop this nightmare from unfolding. Without realizing I use the same word shanda that Dershowitz had used to describe earlier generations. But I don't define shanda as embarrassment among our hosts. I define it as a disgrace to Jewish values and a betrayal of our shared humanity. And in that regard, it has a lot of currency today. Anyway, Alan didn't reply, so my dream of publishing our collected correspondence died an early death. But here's a little postscript along the lines of satire unable to keep up with reality. Just last week, Alan Dershowitz was reported to be hobnobbing with Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago, hashing out strategy to move the ban forward, the ban on a religious group. He was in a really good mood, Dershowitz said about Trump. This was just days after Stephen Bannon was revealed to be a Nazi fan, and just days after Sebastian Gorka was revealed to be a Nazi ally. We are off the cliff. Alan Dershowitz envisioned chutzpah as assertive insistence on first-class status among our peers. I doubt even he could have fathomed in 1991 that first-class status among our peers would one day amount to finding solidarity with the enemies of everything the Jewish people have historically stood for. Now, there's a diatribe, and I apologize, it's bad form to just trash public figure and call it a story as opposed to a sermon. But we're just giving 10 minutes each. I don't really have time for nuance, so I will say this as a closer. Dershowitz is right. It's time to use chutzpah. If we are a people bound by history, memory, and conscience, we must use the most extreme measures at our disposal to stop what has happened. And as Jews, those most extreme measures include comparisons to our most horrific historical experiences. It's time to use chutzpah. It's time to insist members of our community stop giving tacit or active support to what is happening. And it is time to fight tyranny by any means necessary. Thank you.